7 gunmen rode to take the old widow's ranch. Only one saw the Winchester on the roof. She had buried her husband exactly 1 year and 4 days ago, and now, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, Martha Coleman watched the dust rise on the horizon, and knew, with a sinking heart, that the men were finally coming for her land. She was 58 years old. Her hands were rough from years of work. Her back ached in the mornings, and her heart still carried a hole shaped exactly like the man who used to stand beside her at this very window. Everyone in town had told her the same thing after the funeral. Sell the ranch, Martha. A woman alone cannot hold on to 400 acres. A widow has no business fighting men with money and guns. But this land was not just dirt and fence posts to her. It was the place where she had raised her son, the place where her husband had proposed to her under the old cottonwood tree, the place where her 6-year-old granddaughter Lily now slept safe and warm every night because Martha had promised her daughter-in-law, before she passed from fever 2 winters back, that Lily would always have a home. If you have ever felt like the whole world expected you to give up, like you were the only one standing between everything you loved and the people trying to take it from you, then you already understand exactly how Martha felt that morning. And if this story touches something in you, stay with me, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes help arrives in the last place you expect it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight, because stories like this feel better when we know we're not alone in the dark, watching together. The dust on the horizon belonged to 7 riders, and Martha knew exactly who had sent them. Franklin Doss owned nearly every ranch for 30 miles in every direction. And for 2 years, he had wanted the Coleman land because it sat on the only reliable water source between his eastern pastures and his cattle route north. He had offered to buy it 3 times. 3 times Martha had said no, and now, it seemed, he had grown tired of asking politely. She set down her coffee cup, and her hands were shaking, though she would never admit that to anyone. In the next room, Lily was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling under a quilt Martha's own mother had sewn 40 years before. Martha walked to the hall closet, pulled out her late husband's shotgun, and checked that it was loaded, though she knew, deep in her bones, that a widow with 1 shotgun was no match for 7 armed men. It was at that exact moment, as fear pressed cold against her ribs, that a stranger rode up the long dirt road toward her house. He was tall in the saddle, dressed plain, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, and there was something about the quiet way he sat his horse that made Martha's breath catch. Not fear this time, something else, something she had not felt in a very long time. He stopped near the fence, and for a moment neither of them said a word. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and steady, like a man used to speaking to spooked animals and frightened women alike. "Morning, ma'am. I saw your gate was open. Didn't mean to trespass." "You're not trespassing," Martha said, though every instinct told her to be careful. "But I'd ask you to move along. This isn't a good day for visitors." His eyes moved past her, toward the dust clouds still rising on the horizon, and something in his face changed. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded slowly, the way a man does when he understands more than he lets on. "Name's Jonas Hale," he said. "I've been riding through, looking for work. Don't need much. A meal, a place to sleep in the barn, that's payment enough for a few days' labor." Under any other circumstance, Martha would have sent him on his way. She did not know this man. She had a little girl to protect. But there was something steady in him, something that reminded her, painfully, of the way her husband used to stand, feet planted, shoulders squared, like the world could throw whatever it wanted, and he would not move an inch. And there were 7 riders coming. "The barn's yours," she said finally. "But I should warn you, mister, trouble's coming to this ranch today, and it isn't the kind you want to be standing near." Jonas looked at her for a long moment, and something like a small, tired smile crossed his face. "Ma'am," he said, "trouble's about the only kind of company I know how to keep." That first day, Jonas did not ask about the riders again. He simply worked. He mended the sagging fence by the south pasture, fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been broken since winter, and when Lily woke up and came outside, rubbing her eyes, he crouched down to her level instead of towering over her, and asked her name so gently that the little girl, who had not smiled much since her mother died, actually smiled at him. That evening, over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Martha found herself telling him more than she meant to, about her husband, about the land, about Franklin Doss and his endless hunger for water rights and grazing land, and how he had grown impatient with her refusals. Jonas listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something Martha could not quite name. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "A man like that," he finally said, "doesn't stop because a woman says no. He stops when he understands the cost of pushing is higher than the cost of walking away." "And how do we make him understand that?" Martha asked. Jonas did not answer right away. He looked toward the window, toward the darkening sky, and something old and tired moved behind his eyes. "I've made men understand things before," he said quietly. "It's not something I'm proud of, but I know how it's done." That night, after Lily was asleep, Martha lay awake staring at the ceiling. thinking about the stranger sleeping in her barn, a man with kind hands and a dangerous past, and wondering what exactly she had invited onto her land. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke about out loud. Jonas rose before dawn to do the heavy work Martha could no longer manage alone. He fixed what was broken, built what was missing, and slowly, without ever making a show of it, the ranch began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home again. He never touched her, never said a word that crossed a line. But every evening he sat a little closer at supper, and every evening Lily crawled into his lap without asking. And every evening Martha felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long. Trust, she was learning, was not built through pretty words. It was built through a man who chopped wood before you had to ask, who checked the locks on the chicken coop without being told, who taught a grieving little girl how to whistle and laughed, really laughed, the first time she got it right. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed orange across the fields, Martha finally asked the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest for days. "Oh, why are you really here, Jonas? A drifter doesn't stop at a ranch with trouble written all over it unless he's running from something or looking for it." Jonas was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I had a ranch once," he said. "Back in Colorado. Had a wife, too. Good woman. We lost the land to men just like Doss, men who believe money gives them the right to take whatever they want. I wasn't strong enough then, wasn't smart enough. My wife died of a broken heart before I could fix what I'd let happen." He paused, his voice rough. "I told myself I'd never stand by and watch that happen to another family. Not while I still had breath in me." Martha's throat tightened. She understood in that moment that this quiet, careful man was not simply passing through her life. He was here because some old wound in him needed healing just as badly as hers did. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jonas looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something soft and unguarded crossed his face. "Don't be sorry, Martha," he said. "Some things happen so we're ready for the moment that matters. Maybe this is mine." 3 days later, the 7 riders came. Martha heard them before she saw them, the low rumble of hooves on the dry summer road, and her stomach dropped with a fear so familiar it felt like an old, unwelcome friend. She grabbed Lily and pulled her inside, pressing her behind the kitchen table, whispering for her to stay down and stay quiet no matter what she heard. Jonas was already outside. He stood in the yard, calm as still water, his rifle resting easy in his hands, not raised, not threatening, just present. The 7 men reined in their horses a dozen yards from the porch, led by a heavy-set man in a fine coat that did not belong on a working ranch. Franklin Doss himself had come to finish what his patience could no longer wait for. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Doss called out. "Step aside, and this can be simple. The widow signs the deed, we ride out, nobody gets hurt." "She already told you no," Jonas said, his voice flat and unshaken. "Seems to me the simple thing would have been respecting that the first time." One of Doss's men, a lean rider with a nervous, twitchy energy, suddenly glanced upward, and his face went pale. He grabbed Doss's sleeve and pointed toward the roof of the house. There, propped against the chimney, barrel gleaming faintly in the afternoon sun, sat a Winchester rifle, aimed steady and sure down at the yard below. Martha's late husband had built a small lookout perch years ago for hunting wolves that threatened the cattle, and Jonas, in the quiet days before this moment, had climbed up there each morning to watch the road, waiting, preparing, without ever telling Martha a single word about it. "There's someone up there," the nervous rider hissed. Jonas did not turn around. He did not need to. "That's right," he said calmly. "And unlike you boys, whoever's holding that rifle has had 3 days to get real comfortable with exactly where every one of you is standing right now." Silence stretched thin and tight across the yard. Doss's confidence cracked just slightly, his eyes darting toward the roof, toward Jonas, toward the closed front door where he could not see the trembling widow and the frightened child hidden inside. "You'd risk your life for a woman you barely know?" Doss finally said, his voice losing some of its bravado. Jonas's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that silenced every man in that yard. "I know exactly what kind of woman she is," he said. "She's the kind who feeds a stranger before she asks his name, the kind who raised a little girl that isn't even her own blood like she hung the moon just for her. That's worth more than any land you're chasing, Doss. And I've already lost everything once to men who thought money made them untouchable. I won't lose it twice." For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. Then Doss's horse shifted nervously beneath him, sensing the tension, and something in the older man's face finally gave way. He was a businessman, not a killer, and the cost of this fight, with an armed stranger below and an unknown shooter above, had suddenly become far higher than he was willing to pay. "This isn't over," Doss muttered, though everyone in that yard, including Doss himself, understood exactly what those words really meant. It was over. He turned his horse, and one by one, his men followed him back down the dusty road, until the sound of hooves faded into silence. And the only thing left standing in that yard was Jonas and the quiet, steady rifle on the roof. That night, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from fear and relief in equal measure, Martha found Jonas sitting alone on the porch steps, staring out at the dark fields, like a man carrying something heavy he wasn't ready to set down. She sat beside him without a word. "You could have been killed today," she finally said, her voice trembling with everything she had held back all afternoon. "I know," Jonas said quietly. "Why would you do that? Why would you risk everything for a woman and a child you've known less than 2 weeks?" Jonas turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight, Martha saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded and terrified in the way only true honesty can be. "Because somewhere between fixing your fence and watching that little girl learn to whistle," he said softly, "this stopped feeling like a place I was passing through. It started feeling like home. And I haven't had one of those in a long, long time, Martha. I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers without a fight." Tears filled Martha's eyes. Tears she had been holding back since the day she buried her husband, since the day fear became her constant companion, since the moment she convinced herself that love and safety were things she would never be allowed to have again. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "Not just of Doss. Afraid of caring about someone again. Afraid of losing another person I let myself love." Jonas reached over, gently taking her weathered hand in his. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, Martha. Not unless you ask me to." She did not ask him to. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace Martha had almost forgotten was possible. Jonas stayed, not as a hired hand anymore, but as something far more permanent. Word got around town about the standoff at the Coleman ranch, and strangely enough, Franklin Doss never sent another man near that property again, unwilling to test his luck against a rifle on the roof and the steady, unshakable man who had put it there. On a warm autumn afternoon, under the very same cottonwood tree where Martha's late husband had once proposed to her decades before, Jonas got down on one knee, his hands trembling slightly despite his usual steady calm, and asked Martha to be his wife. She said yes before he even finished the question. Lily, standing beside them in her Sunday dress, clapped her small hands with delight, and when the wedding day finally came, it was the little girl who ran up to Jonas afterward, tugging on his sleeve with bright, hopeful eyes. "Can I call you Papa now?" she asked. Jonas knelt down, his throat tight with an emotion too big for words, and pulled her into a gentle hug. "Nothing in this world," he said softly, "would make me happier." That winter, as snow settled soft and quiet over the ranch, Martha stood once again at her kitchen window, coffee warm in her hands this time, watching Jonas teach Lily how to build a snowman in the front yard, their laughter carrying across the fields like music. The land was still hers. The home was still standing. But it was no longer just a place she was fighting to keep. It had become, at long last, a place where she truly belonged, surrounded by the family she never thought she would find again. If this story touched your heart tonight, please take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because it means so much to know we are sharing these quiet, healing moments together. Subscribe if you love slow, emotional Western stories about broken hearts finding their way home, because there are many more stories like Martha and Jonas waiting for you. Thank you for staying until the very end, and I will see you in the next story.